George Strait cancels show after reading fan letter, and the reason left the entire nation in silence. The silence in the small hospital room was broken only by the steady beeping of monitors and the soft rustling of pages as 8-year-old Ethan Miller carefully turned another page of his worn country music magazine. His thin fingers, made even more delicate by months of chemotherapy, traced the image of a tall man in a cowboy hat standing on a massive stage, thousands of fans stretching as far as the eye could see. George Strait, the king of country, his hero. Ethan's mother, Sarah Miller, watched from the uncomfortable chair beside his bed, her heart breaking a little more each time she saw that familiar spark in her son's eyes when he looked at those pictures. At 34, Sarah had already lived through more heartache than most people experience in a lifetime, but nothing had prepared her for the devastation of watching her only child fight a battle that seemed impossible to win. "Mom, did you know George Strait has 60 #1 hits?" Ethan asked, his voice weak but filled with the same enthusiasm he'd shown since discovering country music 2 years earlier. "That's more than anyone else in history. Dad told me that before he—" His voice trailed off, and Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest. "Yes, sweetheart, your daddy loved George Strait's music," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "Remember how he used to play I Cross My Heart on his old guitar every night before bedtime?" Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes distant with memory. "He said it was the song you and him danced to at your wedding. He said it was about promises, about keeping your word no matter what." The boy paused, looking directly at his mother with startling maturity. "Do you think George Strait keeps his promises, Mum?" Before Sarah could answer, the door opened, and Dr. Patricia Hernandez entered, her expression carefully neutral in the way that had become all too familiar to the Miller family. Sarah's stomach dropped. She knew that look. If you're finding yourself moved by Ethan's story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means the world to families like the Millers, and sharing these stories of courage helps spread hope to others facing similar battles. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what real heroism looks like in today's world. "Good morning, Ethan," Dr. Hernandez said warmly, moving to check the boy's chart. "How are we feeling today?" "Better," Ethan lied, with the practiced ease of a child who had learned that positive answers made the adults less worried. "When can I go home, Dr. Hernandez? I want to practice guitar like my dad taught me." The doctor exchanged a meaningful glance with Sarah, one that spoke volumes. They both knew Ethan's condition had worsened significantly over the past week. The aggressive form of acute lymphoblastic leukemia that had invaded his small body was proving resistant to every treatment. They tried. "Sarah, if you could step outside with me for just a moment," Dr. Hernandez said gently. "Ethan, I'll be right back to check on you, okay?" In the hallway, with the door closed behind them, Dr. Hernandez's professional composure softened slightly. "Sarah, I need to be honest with you. The latest tests show that Ethan's white cell count has increased dramatically. We've tried 3 different chemotherapy protocols, and his body isn't responding the way we hoped." What are you saying?" Sarah whispered, though part of her already knew. "I'm saying we need to start thinking about making Ethan as comfortable as possible. We're looking at weeks, maybe a month or 2 if we're fortunate. I'm so sorry." Sarah's legs felt weak. She leaned against the wall, fighting the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. Inside that room was her baby, her brave little boy, who still believed in heroes and happy endings, who still thought his daddy might come back from the war in Afghanistan, who still didn't fully understand that the cancer eating away at his body was winning. Back in the room, Ethan had closed the magazine and was staring out the window at the Tennessee countryside. Crossville wasn't much to look at, just rolling hills and farmland stretching to the horizon. But to Ethan, it represented everything he loved about country music. The simple life, honest people, and stories that mattered. "Mom, I've been thinking," Ethan said when Sarah returned, trying to hide the tears that had started during her conversation with the doctor. "My birthday is next week. I'll be 9. "I know, baby. What would you like to do? We could have a small party here in the room, invite Grandma and Uncle Tommy." Ethan shook his head. "I don't want a party. I want to write a letter." "A letter? To who?" "To George Strait." Ethan's voice gained strength as he spoke. "I want to tell him about Dad and about how his music makes me feel better when I'm scared. And I want to ask him something important." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, taking her son's hand. "What do you want to ask him, sweetheart?" "I want to ask him to sing 'I Cross My Heart' for me, just for me, because—" Ethan paused, and Sarah saw a wisdom in his eyes that no 8-year-old should possess. "Because I might not get to hear it very many more times, and it makes me think about Dad and how much he loved us." The simple request hit Sarah like a physical blow. Here was her dying child, asking for the impossible with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to request a glass of water. The chances of George Strait, a man who performed for sold-out arenas and commanded millions of dollars for appearances, ever seeing a letter from a sick child in rural Tennessee were virtually non-existent. But looking at Ethan's hopeful face, Sarah knew she couldn't be the one to extinguish that hope, not when it might be one of the last dreams her son would ever have. "Okay, baby," she said, squeezing his hand. "Let's write that letter." Over the next 2 hours, Sarah helped Ethan compose what would become the most important letter either of them would ever write. Ethan insisted on writing it himself, his shaky handwriting filling 3 pages of notebook paper with words that came straight from his heart. "Dear Mr. George Strait," the letter began. "My name is Ethan Miller and I am 8 years old. But I will be 9 next week. My mom says I should tell you that I am sick with cancer and the doctors say I might not get better. But I don't want you to be sad about that because your music makes me happy even when I hurt." The letter went on to describe how Ethan's father, Sergeant Michael Miller, had introduced him to country music before deploying to Afghanistan 18 months earlier. How they would sit on the porch of their small farmhouse, Michael teaching, his son guitar chords, while George Strait's voice filled the evening air from an old radio. "My dad said your songs tell stories about real people and real life," Ethan had written. He said, "I Cross My Heart" was about making promises and keeping them no matter what. He promised Mom he would come home from the war, but he didn't. But I know he didn't mean to break his promise. Sarah had to step away from the bed when Ethan wrote those words, the pain of losing her husband mixing with the agony of watching her son face his own mortality with such grace. The letter concluded with Ethan's simple request, "If you could, maybe sing 'I Cross My Heart' for me on my birthday. It would be the best present ever. I know you probably can't come here because you're famous and important, but maybe you could make a video or something. I just want to hear you sing it and think about my dad and know that some promises do get kept." As Sarah sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to George Strait's management company, she had no way of knowing that this simple piece of notebook paper would soon change not only her son's life, but the life of the king of country himself. What she did know was that sometimes, when everything else seems lost, all you can do is believe in the impossible and hope that somewhere out there, someone still understands what it means to keep a promise. The next morning, as Sarah prepared to drive to the post office to mail Ethan's letter, she had no idea that 800 miles away in Nashville, George Strait was about to make a decision that would test everything he believed about success, fame, and what truly matters in life. 800 miles away from that small hospital room in Crossville, George Harvey Strait, Jr. stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office in Nashville's Music Row, watching the city, He had helped build into the country music capital of the world. At 70 years old, George had achieved everything a country artist could dream of and more. 60 number-one hits, countless awards, sold-out stadiums, and a legacy that would outlive him by generations. Yet as he stared out at the bustling streets below, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a profound emptiness. "George, we need to go over tonight's set list one more time," called his longtime manager Tom Bradley from across the mahogany-paneled office. Tom had been with George for nearly 30 years, and his voice carried the familiar urgency that came with managing one of the biggest names in music. "The production crew wants to know if you're still planning to open with 'Here for a Good Time,' or if you want to switch to 'Check Yes or No.'" George didn't turn around immediately. His reflection in the window showed a man who had aged well, but couldn't hide the weariness in his eyes. Tonight's show at Bridgestone Arena was sold out, 20,000 seats filled with fans who would drive hundreds of miles and pay premium prices just to hear him sing the songs that had become the soundtrack to their lives. It was a responsibility he had never taken lightly. "George," Tom pressed, glancing at his watch, "we really need to finalize this. The rehearsal starts in 2 hours. "Sometimes I wonder what it's all for, Tom," George said quietly, still looking out the window. "All these years, all these shows, all these people screaming my name. What does it mean?" Tom Bradley had heard this philosophical mood before. It usually surfaced when George was tired or stressed, which happened more frequently these days. At 70, the grind of touring and performing was taking its toll, even on someone as disciplined and professional as George Strait. "It means you've brought joy to millions of people," Tom replied, walking over to stand beside his longtime friend and client. "It means you've created something that will last forever. How many people can say that?" George finally turned from the window, his weathered face bearing the lines of a man who had lived fully but was beginning to question the cost. "But what have I sacrificed for it, Tom? When was the last time I did something that wasn't calculated, wasn't part of the brand, wasn't designed to sell tickets or records?" The question hung in the air between them. Tom had watched George evolve from a young, hungry artist into a polished entertainment machine, and while the success had been extraordinary, he sometimes wondered if they had lost something essential along the way. "You're having pre-show jitters," Tom said dismissively. "You always get reflective before the big ones. Tonight you'll walk on that stage, see 20,000 people singing every word to every song, and remember why you do this." George nodded, but the doubt remained. He walked to his desk, a massive piece of furniture that had once belonged to Hank Williams Sr., and sat down heavily in the leather chair. Scattered across the desk were contracts, promotional materials, and the endless paperwork that came with being not just an artist, but a business empire. "Tom, do you remember why I started doing this?" George asked, picking up an old photograph from his desk. It showed a much younger George on stage at a tiny honky-tonk in Texas, guitar in, and singing to maybe 50 people in a smoke-filled room. "Because you loved the music," Tom answered without hesitation. "Because you had stories to tell, and you believed those stories mattered." Exactly. Stories that mattered. Real stories about real people. George set the photograph down and looked at his manager. "When was the last time I told a story that actually changed someone's life? Not entertained them, not made them feel good for 3 minutes, but actually changed their life?" Before Tom could answer, there was a knock. On the office door, George's longtime assistant, Maria Santos, entered carrying a stack of mail and looking slightly flustered. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Strait, but there's something here I think you should see," Maria said, holding up a crumpled envelope that looked distinctly out of place among the professional correspondence and fan mail that usually crossed his desk. "What is it?" George asked, extending his hand. "It's a letter from a little boy. It's been sitting in the general fan mail for months, but somehow it got mixed up with some other papers and just surfaced. The thing is—" Maria paused, clearly emotional. "The return address shows it's from a hospital, and the postmark is 6 months old." George took the envelope, immediately noticing the careful handwriting of a child. The paper was wrinkled and worn, as if it had been handled many times before reaching his hands. Something about it made his heart race in a way that had nothing to do with pre-show nerves. 6 months, he repeated, looking at the postmark. "This has been sitting around for 6 months?" Maria nodded apologetically. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Strait. It somehow got filed with some promotional materials and forgotten. I only found it today when I was cleaning out the old files." Tom was already moving toward the door. "George, we really don't have time for fan mail right now. The production meeting is in an hour, and you need to do vocal warm-ups." But George was already tearing open the envelope, his hands surprisingly steady, despite the strange urgency he felt. As he unfolded the 3 pages of notebook paper covered in a child's careful handwriting, the room seemed to grow quiet around him. "Dear Mr. George Strait," he read silently, his eyes moving across words that would change everything. "My name is Ethan Miller, and I'm 8 years old, but I will be 9 next week." As George continued reading, his expression shifted. From casual interest to deep concern, to something approaching anguish, Tom watched his friend's face transform and felt a chill of premonition. "My mom says I should tell you that I am sick with cancer and the doctors say I might not get better," George read, his voice barely a whisper now. "But I don't want you to be sad about that, because your music makes me happy, even when I hurt." The letter went on to describe Ethan's father, Sergeant Michael Miller, killed in action in Afghanistan, and how he had introduced his son to George's music during their precious time together. It told of evenings on the porch, learning guitar, and the promise that "I Cross My Heart" represented to a family torn apart by war and disease. "If you could maybe sing 'I Cross My Heart' for me on my birthday, it would be the best present ever," George read aloud, his voice breaking slightly. "I know you probably can't come here because you're famous and important, but maybe you could make a video or something. I just want to hear you sing it and think about my dad and know that some promises do get kept." The office fell completely silent. Maria was crying openly, and even Tom, who had seen every kind of fan letter imaginable over 3 decades, was visibly moved. George looked at the postmark again, then at his calendar. His blood ran cold as he realized the terrible truth. "Tom," he said, his voice eerily calm, "what's today's date?" "March 15th. Why?" George held up the letter, pointing to a line near the end. "Ethan's birthday was March 16th, 6 months ago. This letter has been sitting in our files for 6 months, and we missed his birthday. We missed his birthday, Tom." The weight of that realization settled on the room like a suffocating blanket. For 6 months, while George had been performing sold-out shows and collecting awards, a dying 8-year-old boy had been waiting for an answer to the most important letter he would ever write. "George, there's nothing we can do about that now," Tom said gently. "It's a tragedy, but these things happen. We get thousands of letters, and some of them inevitably get lost in the system." But George wasn't listening. He was staring at the letter, reading it again, and with each word, something fundamental was shifting inside him. Here was a real story. Here was a promise that mattered more than any contract he had ever signed. "Maria," he said suddenly, his voice gaining strength, "get me information on Ethan Miller in Crossville, Tennessee, hospital records, current condition, everything." "George," Tom interjected, "what are you thinking? We have a show tonight. 20,000 people are expecting you on that stage in 6 hours. George stood up slowly, the letter still in his hands, and looked at his manager with an expression Tom had never seen before. It was the look of a man who had just remembered. who he used to be. Tom, how many times have I performed I Cross My Heart over the years? I don't know. Hundreds, probably thousands. Why? And how many of those times did it actually matter? Really matter? In a way that could change or save someone's life? Tom opened his mouth to argue, but found he had no answer. George walked to his desk and picked up his cell phone, dialing Maria's extension. Maria, I need that information on Ethan Miller right now, and I need you to book me on the next flight to Nashville General Hospital. George, what are you doing? Tom demanded, panic creeping into his voice. George Strait looked at his oldest friend and business partner, then at the letter in his hands, then back at Tom. When he spoke, his voice carried a certainty that brooked no argument. George Strait looked at his oldest friend and business partner, then at the letter in his hands, then back at Tom. When he spoke, his voice carried a certainty that brooked no argument. I'm going to keep a promise that should have been kept 6 months ago. And if that means disappointing 20,000 people tonight, then that's a price I'm willing to pay. As the next 2 hours passed in a blur of frantic phone calls, heated arguments, and desperate attempts to change George's mind. Tom Bradley had seen his client make impulsive decisions before, but nothing. Like this, 20,000 tickets sold, a production crew of over 100 people, vendors, security, media commitments, the financial and reputational implications of cancelling a sold-out show just hours before curtain time was staggering. George, please, just listen to reason for 5 minutes, Tom pleaded, pacing back and forth across the office while George calmly packed a small overnight bag. We can reschedule the show, visit the kid afterward, make a big production out of it. Hell, we can turn it into a charity event, raise money for childhood cancer research, but cancelling tonight is career suicide. George paused in his packing and fixed Tom with a steady gaze. Tom, in all the years you've known me, have I ever broken my word to anyone who truly mattered? No, but this boy has been waiting 6 months for an answer to his letter. His birthday came and went while his letter sat in our files, forgotten. He's dying, Tom. He might already be dead for all we know. George's voice cracked slightly on the last words. If he's still alive, if there's even a chance I can keep this promise, then I have to try. Maria burst through the office door, her face flushed from running. Mr. Strait, I've found him. Ethan Miller is still alive, but he's in critical condition. At Cookeville Regional Medical Center. That's about an hour from Nashville. The hospital confirmed he's been there for the past 2 weeks. The relief that washed over George's face was palpable. Thank God. Get my car ready, Maria. The Silverado, not the limo, and pack my acoustic guitar. George, the media is already starting to ask questions, Tom said, holding up his phone, which had been buzzing non-stop. Word is leaking that something's wrong. If you don't show up tonight without a proper explanation, the speculation will be brutal. George walked to his desk and pulled out a piece of paper. In his characteristic precise handwriting, he wrote, "A brief statement. Due to an urgent personal matter that requires my immediate attention, tonight's concert at Bridgestone Arena is cancelled. All tickets will be fully refunded. I apologize to my fans for any inconvenience and ask for your understanding during this time. Some promises are more important than any show. George Strait." He handed the statement to Tom. "Release that exactly as written. No elaboration, no spin, no explanation beyond what's there." Tom read the statement twice, shaking his head. "This is going to create a firestorm, George. The media, the fans, everyone's going to demand answers." "Let them demand," George replied, shouldering his guitar case. "I've spent 40 years of my life explaining myself to everyone except the people who truly mattered. Today that changes." As George headed for the door, Tom made one last desperate attempt. "What about your legacy? What about everything we've built?" George stopped and turned back to his old friend. "Tom, What kind of legacy is it if at the end of the day I couldn't keep a simple promise to a dying child? All those #1 hits, all those awards, all those sold-out shows. What do they mean if I can't be there for one little boy who believed in me? With that, George Harvey Strait Jr. walked out of his Nashville office, leaving behind the biggest show of his current tour to drive to a small Tennessee hospital to meet a child he had never seen, but who had already changed his life forever. The drive to Cookeville should have taken an hour, but George made it in 45 minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel of his personal truck while his mind raced through everything he wanted to say to Ethan. Behind him, Nashville was exploding with news of the cancelled concert. Social media was on fire with speculation, rumors, and angry comments from disappointed fans. Music industry websites were posting breaking news alerts. But George had turned off his phone after the 15th call from reporters and was now focused on only one thing. Cookeville Regional Medical Center was a modest facility serving the rural communities of central Tennessee. George parked his truck in the visitor lot, grabbed his guitar, and walked through the main entrance with a determination that surprised even him. At the information desk, a young volunteer looked up and did a double take when she recognized him. "Oh my goodness, are you—" "Yes, ma'am. I'm here to see Ethan Miller. I believe he's in the pediatric ward." The volunteer's eyes widened, but she maintained her professionalism as she checked her computer. "Room 312. Take the elevator to the 3rd floor and turn right. But visiting hours don't start until—" "This can't wait," George said gently but firmly. "This is about a promise." As George walked through the hospital corridors, his boots echoing on the polished linoleum floors, he felt a nervousness he hadn't experienced since his very first recording session. This wasn't about performing for thousands of screaming fans or impressing music industry executives. This was about looking into the eyes of a dying child and trying to explain why a simple request had taken 6 months to reach him. Room 312 was at the end of a quiet hallway. Through the small window in the door, George could see a small figure lying in the hospital bed, connected to various machines and monitors. A woman sat in a chair beside the bed, her head resting on her arms as she dozed fitfully. Even from this distance, George could see the exhaustion and worry etched in her posture. He knocked softly on the doorframe and stepped into the room. The woman, Sarah, he assumed, looked up with startled red-rimmed eyes. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. Then understanding dawned on her face, followed immediately by disbelief. She began, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm George Strait, Mom, and I'm here because of this." He pulled Ethan's letter from his shirt pocket, now carefully folded and showing signs of being read many times. "I got your son's letter, and I'm here to keep a promise." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. "But how did you— we never heard back. We thought— Ma'am, I'm so very sorry it took me this long to get here. That letter should have reached me 6 months ago, and it didn't. But I'm here now, and if Ethan is willing, I'd like to sing him that song he requested." At the sound of voices, Ethan stirred in his bed. His eyes fluttered open, still heavy, with medication, and focused on the tall figure standing beside his mother. For several seconds, the boy just stared, as if trying to determine whether he was dreaming. "Mom?" Ethan's voice was weak but clear. Is that really George Strait?" George stepped closer to the bed, his heart breaking at the sight of the frail child who looked so much smaller and more fragile than he had imagined. But Ethan's eyes, those eyes held a light that all the cancer in the world couldn't extinguish. "Hello, Ethan," George said, his voice gentle. "I got your letter, son. I'm sorry it took me so long to answer it, but I'm here now, and I brought my guitar." Ethan's face transformed, the pain and weariness melting away as a smile spread across his features. It was the kind of smile that reminded George why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Pure, honest joy that came from the heart. "You came," Ethan whispered, tears starting to flow down his cheeks. "You really came." George pulled a chair up beside the bed and opened his guitar case. "I made you a promise, didn't I? And where I come from, a man's word is his bond." He looked at Sarah, who was crying openly now, then back at Ethan. "Now I believe you requested a particular song, something about 'I cross my heart'?" Ethan nodded eagerly, trying to sit up straighter in his bed despite the obvious discomfort it caused him. "It was my dad's favorite. He used to sing it to my mom." George tuned his guitar, the familiar ritual calming his nerves. "Tell me about your dad, Ethan." For the next 20 minutes, as George prepared to sing, Ethan talked about Sergeant Michael Miller, his love of country music, his guitar playing, the stories he told about growing up on a farm, and his promise to come home from Afghanistan. Sarah filled in details about Michael's deployment, his death, and how his love of George's music had become Ethan's connection to the father he barely remembered. "He sounds like he was a good man," George said, when Ethan finished. "The kind of man who kept his promises." "He tried to," Ethan replied. "Mum says sometimes promises get broken, even when we don't want them to." George strummed the opening chords of "I Cross My Heart," the melody filling the small hospital room with warmth and hope. "Well, son, this is one promise that's going to be kept." As George began to sing, his rich baritone voice carrying the familiar lyrics, something magical happened in that room. The machines monitoring Ethan's vital signs seemed to quiet. The harsh fluorescent lighting seemed to soften, and for those precious minutes there was no cancer, no grief, no broken dreams, just a man with a guitar singing a song about keeping promises to a little boy who believed in heroes. "I cross my heart and promise to give all I've got to give, to make all your dreams come true," George sang, looking directly into Ethan's eyes. "In all the world you'll never find a love as true as mine." When the song ended, the room was silent except for the sound of quiet crying. Ethan's eyes were closed, but his face showed a peace that Sarah hadn't seen in months. When he opened his eyes, they were bright with something that looked very much like hope. "Thank you," Ethan whispered. "That was perfect." George set his guitar aside and leaned closer to the bed. "Ethan, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. What do you say we spend some time together? I don't have anywhere else I need to be right now." "But don't you have concerts and important things to do?" Ethan asked, the question of a child who had learned not to expect too much from life. George smiled, thinking of the 20,000 empty seats in Nashville and the chaos his decision had undoubtedly created. "Son, right now, there's nowhere in the world I'd rather be than right here with you." And for the first time in years, George Strait meant every word he said. What happened over the next 72 hours would become the stuff of legend in country music circles, though few people knew the complete story at the time. While Nashville buzzed with speculation about George Strait's mysterious disappearance, and social media exploded with theories ranging from health scares to family emergencies, the king of country was experiencing something he hadn't felt in decades. The pure joy of human connection without cameras, contracts, or expectations. George had called Tom from the hospital parking lot on his first night there, his voice tired but more peaceful than his manager had heard it in years. "The boy is incredible, Tom," George had said, sitting in his truck under the pale glow of a parking lot light. "He's been through hell, lost his father, fighting cancer, facing death at 8 years old, and he's teaching me things about courage I never knew." "George, the media circus is getting out of control," Tom had replied, his voice strained with exhaustion. "We've got reporters camping outside your house, calling every hospital in Tennessee, demanding answers. The story is national news now. People are calling you everything from a saint to a has-been who's lost his mind." George had been quiet for a long moment before responding. Let them talk, Tom. For the first time in my career, I don't care what anyone else thinks. I'm exactly where I need to be. Inside the hospital, George had set up a makeshift camp in Ethan's room. The night shift nurses had initially protested, citing hospital policy about overnight visitors, but when they saw the joy on Ethan's face and the determination in George's eyes, they found ways to bend the rules. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, initially skeptical of the disruption a celebrity might cause, became one of George's strongest advocates when she witnessed the positive change in her young patient. "I've been treating children with cancer for 15 years, Dr. Hernandez confided to Sarah on the second day of George's visit. "I've seen family members, friends, even therapy dogs lift a child's spirits temporarily. But what I'm seeing with Ethan is different. His vital signs have improved, his appetite has returned, and there's a light in his eyes that wasn't there before." The transformation was indeed remarkable. Ethan, who had been withdrawn and listless for weeks, was now animated and engaged. He peppered George with questions about the music industry, about touring, about what it was like to perform for thousands of people. But more importantly, he shared his own stories, about his father, about his dreams, about the fears that kept him awake at night. "Are you scared of dying?" George asked gently on their second evening together, as they sat in the dimly lit room, sharing a dinner of hospital cafeteria food that somehow tasted better when eaten with good company. Ethan considered the question seriously, a habit George had noticed in the boy. He never gave quick or easy answers to important questions. "Sometimes," Ethan admitted, "but not as much as I used to be. I was more scared of being forgotten, of not mattering to anyone. But now I know that's not true." "What changed your mind?" "You came," Ethan said simply. "When I wrote that letter, I didn't really think you'd read it. Famous people don't usually have time for kids like me, but you came. And you cancelled your show, and you're sleeping in that uncomfortable chair just to be here. That means I matter, right?" George felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Son, you matter more than you'll ever know. And not just to me, to everyone whose life you've touched with your courage and grace." Meanwhile, outside the insulated bubble of room 312, the story was taking on a life of its own. A nurse's aide had snapped a photo of George playing guitar for Ethan and shared it on social media with the caption, "This is what a real hero looks like." The image went viral within hours, shared millions of times across every platform imaginable. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Country music stars began posting tributes to George's character and compassion. Fans who had initially been angry about the cancelled show were now praising his decision. The hashtag Matka Promise Kept began trending worldwide as people shared their own stories of kindness and kept promises. But perhaps the most powerful response came from unexpected places. Children's hospitals across the country reported an influx of visitors, musicians, actors, athletes, and ordinary citizens inspired by George's example to reach out to sick children in their own communities. The ripple effect of one man's decision to honor a promise was spreading far beyond anyone could have imagined. Inside the hospital, George was largely unaware of the media storm. He had given his phone to Sarah after the 15th reporter somehow obtained his number, and he was focused entirely on Ethan. They spent their days talking, playing music and sharing stories. George taught Ethan more guitar chords on the small acoustic he had brought, while Ethan shared his collection of country music trivia that impressed even the master himself. "Did you know that I Cross My Heart was almost never recorded?" Ethan asked on their third day together, as George helped him practice fingering chords despite the IV line in his arm. "Is that so?" George replied, genuinely curious about what facts this remarkable child had uncovered. "Yeah, I read that the songwriter Wasn't sure it was good enough for you, and almost gave it to someone else. But then he decided to take a chance and send it to your people anyway. George smiled at the irony. Sometimes the best things in life happen when someone decides to take a chance, don't they? Like you taking a chance on coming here. Like me finally doing what I should have done 6 months ago. As the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. Ethan's energy levels increased noticeably. He was sleeping better, eating more, and his color was improving. Dr. Hernandez ran additional tests, trying to understand what she was seeing in his blood work. "I don't want to give false hope," she told Sarah and George privately on the 4th day. "But Ethan's white blood cell count has stabilized for the first time in months. His body seems to be responding to something, though I can't explain what medically." George and Sarah exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing, but neither wanting to voice it aloud. Could hope itself be a form of medicine? Could the simple act of feeling valued and loved have actual healing power? "Sometimes miracles happen in ways we don't understand," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe Ethan just needed to know that someone believed he was worth fighting for." That evening, as George sat beside Ethan's bed reading him stories from a book of country music legends, Ethan interrupted with a question that caught him off guard. "George, what's the biggest crowd you ever played for?" "Oh, probably about 80,000 people at a festival in Texas a few years back." "Why do you ask?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, then looked up at his new friend with those wise eyes that seemed too old for his young face. "Do you think you'll ever want to play for big crowds again? I mean, after spending time here with just me?" It was a profound question from an 8-year-old boy, and George realized he didn't have an immediate answer. The truth was, he hadn't thought about performing, touring, or his career at all since arriving at the hospital. For the first time in decades, he had been completely present in each moment, focused entirely on the person in front of him rather than the next show, the next deadline, the next obligation. "You know what, Ethan?" George said finally. "I think maybe I've been playing for the wrong reasons for a long time. The size of the crowd doesn't matter if you're not connecting with the people in it. But you do connect with people. Your songs make them feel better, just like they made me feel better when I was missing my dad." George nodded slowly, understanding something about his own career that had eluded him for years. Maybe the key is remembering that every person in that crowd has a story, has struggles, has hopes and dreams, just like you do. Maybe if I can remember that, the music will mean something again. "It already means something," Ethan said, with the confidence of a child who had lived through more than most adults. "It just means something different now." On the 5th morning of George's stay at the hospital, Dr. Hernandez arrived with results that would change everything. Her face showed a mixture of professional caution and barely contained excitement as she entered room 312, where George was teaching Ethan a simplified version of Amarillo Morning on the guitar. "Sarah, George, I need to speak with you both," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Ethan, would you mind if your mom and Mr. Strait step outside with me for just a moment?" Ethan looked between the adults, his young face showing concern. "Is something wrong? Are you going to make George leave?" "No one's going anywhere, son," George assured him, though he felt his own anxiety rising. "We'll be right back." In the hallway outside Ethan's room, Dr. Hernandez delivered news that no one could have expected. "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this," she began, holding up Ethan's latest test results. "Ethan's cancer markers have dropped significantly. His white blood cell count is approaching normal levels for the first time since his diagnosis. His body is not just fighting the disease, it appears to be winning." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What does that mean? Is he going to be okay?" "I can't make any guarantees, but if these trends continue, we might be looking At remission, full remission. Dr. Hernandez shook her head in amazement. I can't explain it medically. The same treatments that weren't working a week ago suddenly seemed to be having dramatic effects. George felt his knees go weak with relief and joy. So he's going to live. All signs point to yes. More than that, he might be able to live a completely normal life. As they stood in that hospital hallway, absorbing news that seemed too good to be true, George realized that everything was about to change again. Ethan was going to recover, which meant George would eventually have to return to his life in Nashville. But he also knew that life would never be the same again. What none of them could have predicted was that this was just the beginning of the story, and that 6 months later, George Strait would be standing on stage in Nashville with a very special guest, about to deliver a performance that would remind the world why music truly matters. But first, they had some incredible news to share with a brave little boy who was about to discover that sometimes, when you least expect it, miracles really do happen. 6 months later, the backstage area of Bridgestone Arena buzzed with an energy unlike anything George Strait had experienced in his 4-decade career. Tonight wasn't just another concert, it was a celebration, a testament to the power of kept promises, and a reminder that sometimes the most important performances happen not for thousands, but for an audience of one. "You nervous, partner?" George asked, adjusting the small cowboy hat on 9-year-old Ethan Miller's head. The boy looked remarkably different from the frail child George had met in that hospital room 6 months earlier. His cheeks had color, his eyes sparkled with health and excitement, and his hair had grown back thick and brown after completing his final round of chemotherapy. "A little," Ethan admitted, peeking through the curtain at the sold-out crowd of 20,000 people. "That's a lot of people. You know what I learned from a very wise young man once?" George said, kneeling down to Ethan's eye level. "The size of the crowd doesn't matter if you're connecting with the people in it. And tonight, every single person out there is here because of you." The journey to this moment had been extraordinary. After Ethan's miraculous recovery, George had stayed in touch with the Miller family, visiting whenever his schedule allowed, and watching with joy as the boy regained his strength and zest for life. The bond they had formed in that hospital room had only grown stronger, and when George announced his return to Bridgestone Arena to make up for the cancelled show, he knew exactly who he wanted to share the stage with. "Mr. Strait," came a voice from behind them. Tom Bradley approached, his face showing a mixture of pride and amazement. "The crew is ready when you are, and George—" Tom paused, emotion evident in his voice. "I owe you an apology. 6 months ago, I thought you were making the biggest mistake of your career. Tonight, I realize you were making the smartest decision of your life." George smiled and clapped his old friend on the shoulder. "Sometimes we have to lose our way to find what really matters, Tom." In another corner of the backstage area, Sarah Miller watched her son with tears of joy streaming down her face. The woman who had once prepared to say goodbye to her only child was now watching him prepare to perform on one of country music's biggest stages. Beside her stood Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who had flown in from Tennessee specifically for tonight's show. "I still can't fully explain what happened medically," Dr. Hernandez said to Sarah, "but I know what I witnessed. Sometimes healing comes from places science can't measure." "Love," Sarah said simply. He felt truly valued and loved for the first time since losing his father. That gave him the strength to fight. The arena was filling with an unusual energy. Word had spread through social media about Ethan's recovery and his planned appearance. Tonight, fans had brought signs reading "Promise Kept" and "Ethan Strong." Many in the audience were families affected by childhood cancer, who had been given free tickets through a foundation George had quietly established in Ethan's honor. As showtime approached, George gathered his band for a final briefing. These musicians who had performed with him for years understood that tonight was different. This wasn't just about entertainment. It was about celebrating life, courage, and the bonds that connect us all. "Gentlemen," George addressed his band, "we've played together on the biggest stages in the world, but tonight we're playing for something bigger than ourselves. That little boy out there taught me more about courage and grace in 5 days than I learned in 70 years of living. Let's make sure this performance honors that." The lights dimmed in the arena, and 20,000 people rose to their feet as George Strait walked onto the stage. The roar was deafening, but there was something different about it, deeper, more emotional than the usual concert enthusiasm. These fans knew they were witnessing something special. "Good evening, Nashville," George said into the microphone, his voice carrying the warmth and authenticity that had made him a legend. "6 months ago, I made a decision that some folks thought was crazy. I cancelled a show just like this one to keep a promise to a young man who believed in the power of music to heal." The crowd erupted in applause, understanding immediately what this night represented. "That young man taught me that success isn't measured in #1 hits or sold-out arenas," George continued. "It's measured in the promises we keep and the lives we touch along the way. Tonight, I want you to meet someone who changed my life forever." George turned toward the side of the stage and extended his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my friend, Ethan Miller." Ethan walked onto the stage with the confidence of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious. He carried a small acoustic guitar, the same one George had given him in the hospital, and waved to the crowd with a smile that could have powered the entire arena. The audience was on its feet instantly, applauding not just for the boy's appearance, but for everything he represented: hope, resilience, and the triumph of the human spirit. Many people in the audience were crying openly, moved by the sight of this healthy, happy child who had captured the nation's heart. "Folks, this is Ethan Miller," George said, putting his arm around the boy's shoulders. "He's 9 years old, he's cancer-free, and he's got something he wants to share with you tonight." Ethan stepped up to his own microphone, specially adjusted for his height. "Hi, everyone," he said, his young voice carrying clearly through the arena's sound system. "6 months ago, I was really sick and scared. I wrote a letter to Mr. George asking him to sing my favorite song because I thought I might not get to hear it many more times." The arena was completely silent now, 20,000 people hanging on every word from this remarkable child. "But Mr. George did something better than just sing the song," Ethan continued. "He showed me that keeping promises is the most important thing in the world. He showed me that I mattered, that my life had value, and that gave me the strength to fight and get better." The emotion in the arena was palpable. Grown men were wiping their eyes, and the applause was thunderous. "Tonight, I want to help Mr. George keep another promise. The promise to give you the show you missed 6 months ago. So let's make some music together." What followed was a performance that would be talked about for generations. George and Ethan performed several songs together, their voices blending in perfect harmony, despite the decades between their ages. Ethan played his guitar with skill that amazed everyone who witnessed it, the result of months of practice and determination. But the moment everyone had been waiting for came near the end of the show. As the opening chords of the requested song filled the arena, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the song that had started it all, the promise that had changed too, lives forever. George and Ethan stood side by side at center stage, their guitars creating a gentle melody that seemed to embrace everyone in the building. As they sang together about promises and love that endures, about crossing hearts and giving everything to make dreams come true, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. When the song ended, The silence lasted for several heartbeats before the arena exploded in the longest, loudest standing ovation in Bridgestone Arena's history. People were cheering, crying, and celebrating not just a performance, but a reminder of what truly matters in life. As the applause continued, George knelt down beside Ethan and spoke into his microphone one final time. "Folks, 6 months ago I had to choose between disappointing 20,000 people and keeping a promise to one little boy. Tonight, I learned that sometimes when you choose to do the right thing for one person, you end up touching 20,000 hearts." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, all connected by this shared moment of joy and hope. "Ethan taught me that the most important audience isn't the biggest one. It's the one that needs you most. Tonight, you've all been part of something bigger than a concert. You've been part of a celebration of life, love, and the promises that bind us together." As George and Ethan took their final bow together, the arena erupted once more. But this time, the applause wasn't just for the performance, it was for the lesson they had all learned about what it means to truly matter to someone else. Later that night, as the arena emptied and the lights dimmed, George and Ethan sat together on the edge of the stage, their guitars beside them. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly. "Not just for tonight, but for keeping your promise when it really mattered." George smiled, looking out at the empty seats that had been filled with so much joy and emotion. "Thank you for teaching me what my promises are really worth." As they sat there, in the peaceful quiet of the empty arena, both of them knew that this wasn't really an ending, it was a beginning. George had rediscovered his purpose as an artist, and Ethan had discovered that his life had immeasurable value and infinite possibility. The king of country had sung to sold-out crowds for 40 years, but he had never performed for a more important audience than one brave little boy in a hospital room. And in keeping that promise, he had reminded the world that sometimes the most powerful music isn't heard by millions, it's felt by the hearts that need it most.